Now, the National Education, Health and Allied Workers Union has taken a decision not to campaign for the ANC in the upcoming local government elections. In fact, let me just make sure that we have this correct. The union has been saying that it is considering taking that decision, but it still has to hold its meetings to come to a conclusion around that. But at the same time, this obviously has to do with the upcoming local government elections, which a meeting of COSATU has also been ongoing. And I can tell you that today, the outcomes of a special Central Executive Committee meeting of the COSATU, that's the federation, they will communicate the outcomes of that meeting, which we understand would have this element about whether or not to support the ANC in the upcoming local government elections. And talking about these issues, let's bring into the conversation now Lebohang Pheko, and she is joining us from Johannesburg to talk to us about what her thoughts are around these threats. Lebohang, thank you very much for your time. Before we get into the COSATU matters, let's talk about whether government indeed does have the money to follow through on this 2018 wage agreement, which has been stalled.
So thanks, Bole. I mean, we know that so far the government has said that they're going to have to cut the public sector wage bill by about 160 billion rands. And of course, this has led to a deadlock, as you have rightly said. And of course, this was also as a result of different other, modalities. So there are a few things that come to mind. The one is, what is actually the public sector wage bill? And I think we need to be very mindful to differentiate between the different levels and sectors of public workers. So there's a huge difference between your large, your doctors, your nurses, your public sector workers who are very much the frontliners, your police officers, your teachers, and so on. And then your better paid, public municipal officials, your government officials in the higher echelons. There's also quite a lot of wastage. And I think that it's important that at a time right now, especially during the COVID crisis, where your frontline workers are very necessary, teachers are doing extraordinary work right now, having to manage the modalities of hybrid learning. Of course, the nurses and the doctors in the public sector particularly are taking quite a pounding, a huge amount of pressure on them. I think it's incredibly demoralizing right now to be speaking about cutting the public wage, the public wage bill. We should, of course, differentiate between non-performance and I think inflation-related pre-agreements, and it does seem to be a breach of faith.
Yeah.
Do we have the money? It's arguable. I think there are different places that we might be able to get the money. We could be able to get the money, for example, by increasing tax revenues, by dealing with illicit financial flows. Remember that the Auditor General has continuously spoken about the wastage across government departments in expenditure. I think it was 2 billion rands, and that is pre-COVID, for example. So I think in terms of where there's the scope to be a lot more creative around where the money comes from. I mean, things like state-owned SOE foreign debt repayments. We could place a moratorium on some of those to open up the funding right now, which is extremely important.
Yeah. Let's talk about whether the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, can use the excuse that COVID-19 has decimated resources. Therefore, we genuinely cannot live up to the expectations of this last leg of the 2018 agreement. Can he use COVID-19 as a legitimate excuse?
So 500 billion rands were set aside, remember, for part of the COVID relief package. And of that 500 billion so far, I think only about a third of companies who even applied for any of that relief have received it. I think only 12% of SMMEs, if I stand under correction, have been able to access that. So it's not as if that money has actually been spent. It has been put aside, but it hasn't been per se spent. And there's the reasons for that, the paperwork, the bureaucracy, the red tape, the need to to be tax compliant, the need to be CIPIC, to be CIPIC compliant and so forth. So it's made it very difficult for that money to be accessible. But that does mean that there's potentially that kind of money is somewhere in the ether. I think another thing as well is that this should be seen as a continuum to the minister's pre-existing commitment to a form of what I call soft gear. And I think if you look at his report, that was the economic policy report that he published in around August 2019.
2019,
yeah.
August, somewhere there.
Yeah. Just before, just 6 months before this tsunami of a moment that we're in. He was already talking about things around relaxing rules to make it easier to do business in this country, maintaining a flexible exchange rate, inflation targeting, and sustainable fiscal policy. And for sustainable fiscal policy is also around privatizing government assets. And that's there for anybody to read. So this, unfortunately, this kind of predates, this sentiment predates the COVID moment. And I do think that we should be very mindful not to use the COVID moment as an excuse. And when I say we, I mean the state, I mean the economic cluster and the economic policy makers, to use this really as an alibi to put in place basically soft austerity, if austerity can ever be thought of as soft. So that would include currency devaluation, that would include reducing the public sector wage bill, which is a very market orthodox, quite neoliberal approach, because this is at a time when I think many countries are actually spending more money, expending more money in public expenditure, because they appreciate that you need to build a vibrant frontline public sector, especially because this is exactly why so many countries are struggling, not only South Africa, but I mean, we see the disaster that's the US, the disaster that's in Brazil, the disaster across the UK, France, India, and so on. And that's really as a result of years of this expenditure in the public sector. So this is actually, seems to be quite counter-logical.
So, Lebohang, I'm worried that our line is going to fail us, as it's already starting to reflect that. So let's quickly move through these quick points around COSATU. Earlier in the intro, mentioning that the Federation will be reporting back from its meeting of its special Central Executive Committee meeting, and key among those discussions is obviously the issue of the jobs bloodbath, but also the element about what will be the Federation's attitude towards the ANC when we go towards these local government elections. Can we expect any dramatic decisions to come out of this media briefing?
Yeah, the point with COSATU and their very complicated relationship with the ANC and this tripartite alliance of allies that don't always seem to like each other very much. It's a threat that we've heard before. We've heard this in 2016. I remember this even in 2012 around similar issues, whether it's around personalities or whether it's particularly around economic policy. And I remember very clearly 2016, the same noises were made leading up to the national elections as well. The same similar in 2014, the same similar protests were made, but not much comes out of it. And I think there's a difference between not campaigning and withdrawing with support. Withdrawing with support would actually mean then disaligning and delinking completely from this alliance and actually standing as an independent federation which is completely vested in workers' interests. And I think it's always been a very complicated and I think compromised position to be in. On the one hand, part of this tripartite alliance, which is the buttress of power, whilst on the other hand having these internal contradictions. And it certainly calls into question the notion of this broad church. And I think really 26, 27 years into this dispensation, is that still the most viable way of doing governance in this country? Is that still effective? Is that still serving the interests either of democracy, of the workers, and of activist policy making?
Yeah, very briefly for me, Lebohang, when Gwede Mantashe in 2015 warned COSATU that it might evolve into what he called at the time a yellow federation if dominated by public sector unions. In simple language, what was he warning about there?
Well, I think that he was really warning around, I mean, some of the federation, he was drawing on some old Marxist theories, Italians and so forth, the Spanish, and the way that some federations actually became rubber stamping institutions or rubber stamping instruments, which instrumentalized government policy rather than being really independent, vibrant figures in their own right. I think that's very old Marxist language, and it does lead us back to the notion of whether or not trade unions in their current formation and trade unions in their current construction are the most effective way of representing workers' issues. The membership globally, that's not just a COSATU thing, but membership globally has come down quite significantly. Younger people and younger workers who are entering the workforce don't necessarily find the same resonance in mass action, don't necessarily find the same resonance in the sort of collective bargaining, the collective struggle, and also may not necessarily see value because there are different formations, different professional formations and so forth. But I also think that the role of workers' unions, the role of workers' rights, and the spaces for that is something that should never and will never die down. And even though we're hearing that perhaps even the constructions and the definitions of work and a worker may change, there's the fourth industrial revolution and so on, there will always be workers, and there will always be the need for formations that serve their interests effectively. I'm just not sure whether in its current construction and with its pre-existing alliance and deep alliance to the ANC, whether COSATU has been able to do that as effectively as it should have.
All right, Lebohang Pheko, thank you very much for your insights there. Senior Research Fellow and Economist at Trade Collective. Thanks indeed for your time.